All right. Thank you for coming out to our final faculty colloquium of the year. It's my pleasure to introduce John Lundy. He is an assistant professor and chair of the interdisciplinary studies at EOU. His central focus has been understanding practical reason at the intersection of ethics and epistemology. His ongoing work in normative social and political theory takes up an interdisciplinary research program that combines multiple fields, including moral philosophy, social theory, and political science, in order to develop a conceptual understanding of the contemporary world. He is especially interested in egalitarianism, justice, democracy, critical theory, and most recently, the complex relationship between human progress and technological development. Please help me welcome John Lundy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today, especially to my students like Jagger here for sitting through extra hours of me talking today. It's already listened to some, so I appreciate that. In the Western tradition, at least since the Enlightenment, most moral philosophers and political theorists have thought that their task was to develop credible alternatives to the traditional justification of norms, principles, and institutions based on settled tradition or divine authority. The prevailing Enlightenment tendency was to insist that the best way to figure out how to live would involve, instead, or in addition to these methods, a significant role for some kind of thinking process called practical reasoning. Today, we face the dilemma that globalization, in the face of diversity, has made it increasingly impossible to ignore the absence of any settled tradition that could act as a foundation for moral, social, and political practices. While both modern and ancient conceptions of practical reason have fallen under suspicion, some of it well-founded. At the same time, today, the outright enemies of democracy are now legion, and many of the core structures and institutions of a constitutional republic, such as a civil society with a well-functioning public sphere and a working system of protections for constitutionally enshrined basic rights and freedoms, are coming apart at the seams in ways scarcely imaginable just decades ago. Under these conditions, can we still expect to find in reason a legitimate basis for our social and political norms and practices? I suggest we can. And in these times of democratic backsliding, a clear defense of the norms underlying a democratic political philosophy become even more urgent. Drawing on various strands of moral rationalism, including John Rawls' political liberalism, and especially Jürgen Habermas's discourse ethics, and Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum's capabilities ethics, I propose a version of moral political rationalism that I'm calling the Discourse-Capabilities Approach. Today, I seek to sketch an outline of that approach. This figure here aggregates a simplified, very high-level summary of the general justificatory strategies of Martha Nussbaum's neo-Aristotelian version of the capabilities approach, together with the broadly neo-Kantian approach of both John Rawls' political liberalism and Jürgen Habermas's critical theory. Each theory incorporates some aspect which I claim introduces non-subjective elements that feed into the establishment of a moral political norm capable of guiding our collective existence on the basis of a public form of reason. For Habermas, these include the logical and semantic rules that make up the non-procedural norms of reason. These include basic rules of logic, such as the law of non-contradiction. Since reason cannot be justified using reason, this would be circular and prove nothing, it's fairly easy to see how these principles necessarily represent a terminus point for rational justification. Even the procedural principle of discourse, just denoted by Habermas as D. This gives expression to the idea that the rationally valid norm must be freely accepted on the basis of no force other than reason. This has a fair claim to represent a fundamental and irreducible aspect of rationality, because any form of assent that deserves to be called a rational assent must be understood as given freely rather than forced. Similarly, for Rawls, there is a fundamental aspect of practical reason he calls the rational, which includes the basic practical capacity to reflect on our ends, as well as our instrumental capacity to pursue the most efficient means to achieve those ends. Finally, for Nussbaum, there's the objective grounding experiences, which define the basic spheres in which human beings necessarily function, either well or poorly. Although these do not claim the status of being directly and infallibly intuited by reason, they may have, as they may have for Aristotle, many of them have been fairly well established, widely accepted as biologically and anthropologically deep-seated aspects of human existence. I propose that the most adequate approach ought to and can consistently incorporate all these features. Unfortunately, however, even taken together, these features will not be enough. All these approaches have grappled, implicitly or explicitly, with the fact that these aspects are insufficient to rationally ground the normative project advanced in each case. Pure logic without procedural principles, including the principle of universalization, Habermas denotes it just with the letter U, the rational, not limited by the reasonable, that's Rawls' terminology, and spheres of human functioning without a normative account of the human being to define good functioning are all inadequate on their own. This is the reason why these approaches introduce additional morally substantive content in the form of procedural principles in the case of Habermas, the reasonable in the case of Rawls, and a normative count of the human being in the case of Nussbaum. And this is where things get particularly tricky. Any adequate account of moral reasoning must offer an account of the nature and warrant for this content by answering A, what is the specific substantive content of these additional elements, and B, what is their epistemic status? That is, how are they justified? These key issues must be addressed before proceeding with any synthesis. With respect to the former question, I want to argue there is room in these contemporary debates for significant clarification. The additional substantive content in each theory is supplied by Habermas's principle U, which states that a norm is deemed valid only when all interested parties can accept the consequences of its general adoption. Rawls' conception of society and person, or Nussbaum's own normative account of the person, respectively. While I do not wish to maintain that the substantive content of each aspect is equivalent or functions to produce precisely parallel results, I do wish to point to the fact that each element shares a critical core idea worked out in various ways. Moreover, I want to forward the proposition that this core idea is the only necessary piece of substantive content required over and above the basic non-subjective elements already enumerated above. And relatedly, I want to suggest that to the extent that the additional substantive content of each theory is adequate, it is so to the extent that it properly works out the implications of this core idea. The basic idea I have in mind is the idea of the fundamental equality of all rational agents. Whatever else it entails, fundamental moral equality itself can simply be expressed as the proposition that all rational actors, persons, deserve equal moral consideration and the ability to participate freely and on par with others. Nussbaum's version of the capabilities approach, introduced by Amartya Sen, broadly defines the focal variable of value and egalitarian concern in human life as functionings, any doings and states of being, and the capability to achieve such functionings. Nussbaum's argument that every human life necessarily functions within certain spheres of experience does not contain or entail the egalitarian assumption that we ought to strive for the equal achievement of individuals within the space of functionings and capabilities. Rather, the idea of the fundamental moral equality of rational actors is part of both Sen and Nussbaum's conception of the person, and the elucidation of the functionings and capabilities sphere as the evaluative space of egalitarian consideration has no apparent point or function without this assumption. Similarly, Rawls' notion of the rational does not embody any assumption regarding equal moral consideration. For Rawls, practical reason is composed of two irreducible elements: the reasonable and the rational. The rational, as I've said before, is our capacity for a full conception of the good life and the idea that we can critically evaluate our own ends, and also encompasses the instrumental reason subsequently deployed in pursuit of those ends. While the rational is associated with our full or thick conception of the good life, necessarily something particular to each individual, the reasonable is associated with the more restricted idea of morality, or the moral political, as Rawls calls it, or justice, which concerns not a full account of the good life, but more narrowly just what we owe to other members of society. Thus, we are reasonable when we act out of a desire to justify our public political actions, those affecting others, on grounds others could not reasonably reject. And in doing so, constrain the rational and our full conception of the good by a publicly shared basis of reasoning. One can form and pursue goals in a way that is completely rational while refusing to acknowledge or respect the interests and considerations of anyone else. The implication of the equal dignity and respect which is to be accorded to anyone capable of forming rational interests is only worked out in Rawls' notion of the reasonable limits placed on the purely rational. Finally, Habermas was clear that of all the rational rules and principles presupposed by communicative action, that is, action oriented towards reaching understanding rather than action oriented towards success, the only one with moral content is the principle of universalization, U, and it is U that embodies the idea of fundamental equality that is then worked out in terms of universalizable interests. Though it includes many other ideas, the most basic postulate contained in Nussbaum's conception is the fundamental equality of persons. The reasonable for Rawls, though it may rely on other ideas, and U for Habermas are above all the attempt to spell out exactly what we owe each other as a direct implication of our fundamental moral equality. Oh, thank you. Well, where did my cursor go? Here it is. There, it's back. Furthermore, each of these approaches is incomplete without the additional substantive content supplied by one or the other theoretical construct, which I claim revolves around the one central notion of equality. Thus, it seems that if any version of moral rationalism is going to succeed, the one indispensable idea that is needed beyond D, beyond logical and semantic rules, beyond the rational and beyond grounding experiences, is fundamental equality. The key question, I contend, must now concern the status of this idea. In other words, is fundamental equality a freestanding assumption that goes beyond moral rationalism, or is the assumption contained somehow within an account of practical reason itself? To begin with, there is every reason to suppose that the idea stands apart from the other principles of practical reason. For instance, when I disagree with the libertarian about whether the facts of basic moral equality implies that the focal variable of practical equality seeking should be certain negative rights, I stand ready with counterarguments. Likewise, if a misogynist doubts that women should be considered persons, I'm prepared to argue that if men are persons, women must be as well. But if someone, Nietzsche, for example, expresses profound disgust for the very idea of equality, claiming that it's proper for the strong to dominate and assert their power over the herd of the weak, I'm not certain there is a way to respond that he's failed to respect some logical principle of inference, evidentiary criterion of justification, or any similar standard of correctness. Even if we can't show that Nietzsche is being irrational in this respect, we could surely say he's being unjust, inhumane, uncompassionate, unreasonable in Rawls' sense. But does this entail violation of anything that deserves to be called practical reason? I suspect that it does, and I will strive towards an explanation of this now. For Rawls, instead of starting out with our thick cultural universal and its substantive conception of what constitutes the best sort of life, we look for agreement on a thinner norm that has to do with the demands of justice or fairness. This thin but substantive set of cultural norms would act as a sort of minimum filter that would determine what deeper and more specific values are chosen and choices can pass through. Equality is the most fundamental component of this thin account, and for Rawls, equality as the key underlying idea of the reasonable depends precisely on a factual agreement. On this view, there is some aspect of justice, the most substantive part, that evades a universal rational explanation that could convince a rational moral skeptic through argument and evidence. From this perspective, the moral skeptic can be answered by deriving principles of justice, cannot be answered by deriving principles of justice from rationality. The status of shared culturally inherited norm seems inadequate to the task of incorporating a principle of fundamental moral equality within any genuine form of moral rationalism, despite Rawls' insistence that the reasonable is part of practical reason. Unlike Rawls, it seems Nussbaum wants the norm of equality to have a universal status, but fails to offer an explanation of how the norm is able to claim it. Useful as it may be, her idea of grounding experiences is too thin to yield the sort of universal normative claim she wants to make about the nature of a well-functioning human life. Good, it's still up there. Examining my figure, it should be apparent that once we have excluded Nussbaum's neo-Aristotelian idea of personhood and Rawls' culturally inherited conception of society and person, the only general route remaining by which the notion of fundamental moral equality could feed into the establishment of rationally valid norms is you. Fortunately, Habermas's general justificatory strategy for you looks promising. If legitimate universals are the outcome of a real process, then we must imagine that process to be a fair one. That would involve the process itself being regulated by certain norms or ideals. Most likely norms such as everyone deserves a free and equal opportunity to participate. Ultimately, it cannot be the case that every norm is always derived from reasonable procedures, because there needs to be some prior universals governing the procedure in the first place. Hence, we are led to conclude the need for some, at least thin, universals underlying communicative action as pragmatic presuppositions. In addition to other principles of practical reason, I suggest that fundamental equality has this status. The universal I'm proposing as necessary is very thin. In fact, it's one principle, a single claim: all persons are moral equals who need participatory parity in communicative action. With the addition of this one simple commitment, I propose we can go on to work out discursively all the provisional principles that would be needed to govern the requisite discursive process of cultural translation and negotiation. Principles such as everyone involved should have a chance to participate, to have the conversation put in terms understandable to the participants addressed. Participants should be free from coercion, manipulation, and deceit. Everyone should be required to listen and to work to understand the position of their other interlocutors. And everyone must be sufficiently resourced and secure not to be subject to domination by other individuals or organizations, and quite likely other conditions besides these. While the particular implications may be worked out in different ways, if we are going to participate in a communicative mode of interaction and coordinate our activity on the basis of reasoned discourse, which is a species-level capacity of human beings and a universal feature of human social interaction, then we need to begin from the basic notion that participants are members of a discourse community by virtue of their unique status as rational agents or persons, which makes them fundamentally equal to other participants. Part of what it means to view someone as a person and engage with him or her rationally means not invoking power, status, or any other form of superior social or material position in order to influence belief or compel compliance. Notice here that I'm not committing to defend the full details of Habermas's particular formulation of the pragmatic presuppositions of communication, but the general idea that these are correctly seen as trying, in part, to work out the implications of equality, which is a genuine pragmatic presupposition of practical reason on the most fundamental level. To recap then, the contemporary approaches on which I am drawing here contain elements: the rational, grounding experiences, the principle D, and other pragmatic principles, presuppositions of communicative action, which all function as non-subjective resources for the establishment of norms on the basis of reason. These approaches agree, if not explicitly, then in the form of their account, on the fact that some additional morally substantive content is necessary. Despite the complex and varied conceptions and principles proposed, at root, what is being introduced is the fundamental moral principle of equality, which becomes complicated only in trying to spell out its precise implications. If we're going to interact with others as rational agents, subjects who are the source and seat of value and not merely things, then we must first accept their inclusion under this special status of persons, fundamentally different from other physical objects of the natural world. A status which is one and the same for ego and alter alike. The first and most obvious thing I want to highlight about my discourse capabilities approach The first and most obvious thing I want to highlight about my discourse capabilities approach is the central place given to reflective procedures. While all the accounts on which I draw here are inherently democratic accounts, which accord some significance to reflective procedures of some sort or another, this approach centers on communicative reason in the strongest possible sense. Instead of starting from any fixed, thick understanding, this approach has moved, with Habermas, to a more discursive, procedural understanding of reason, in which aspects of the procedure itself can be open to ongoing renegotiation. At the same time, however, the procedural reason that I look towards has universal normative content embodied in the reflective process itself. Understood in this way, reasoning can fulfill what I characterize as one of moral rationalism's central aspirations by providing a standard that is both immanent, not to be found outside concrete forms of life, language, and institutions, and transcendent, a regulative idea that we can critically apply to criticize existing conduct, activities, and institutions. Once reasoning is understood in this more procedural way, the universals which the process of discourse, debate, and renegotiation generate will have the character of remaining provisional and never being fully or finally articulated. The ability to criticize and move beyond the conventional formulations and parochial instantiations of a norm always remain possible, according to the Discourse Capabilities account, because of the transcendent potential of procedural reason, the ability to constantly have ideas challenged and subject to reason contestation from without, even from sources that are radically other, including those arising from completely different cultural contexts. Now, the topic or objective of this rational discourse is concerned with central questions of practical life, including specific questions such as, what is the right action to take in a specific context? And even more fundamentally, general questions such as, what would a good or well-functioning human life look like? The answers are not fixed in advance. Answering them is the unavoidable and ongoing task of humanity, and individually of every human life. Having given a very rough introduction to some of the key elements I am including in my view, I will now outline the broad contours of my discourse capabilities approach to grounding normative political framework. I will do so by showing how my approach can be seen as the outcome of following through a progression of 5 fundamental moral questions. I begin with the question, what has value? To answer this question, I propose drawing on fundamental Kantian insights into the special status of persons as rational agents who bestow value through the act of valuing. Such an approach has 2 key implications. First, that all rational beings bear a unique status. Persons, in virtue of their rational agency, would have an inviolable dignity as valuable ends in themselves, the only thing valuable not on account of someone else valuing them. Therefore, whatever else we value or choose to pursue persons have a unique highest order value that trumps all derivative forms of value. This entails that one ought never to adopt a purely instrumental attitude towards others. The second consequence is that the things people have reason to value are themselves invested with ethical value. The capabilities approach offers a particularly sophisticated analysis of this form of value, arguing that what is valuable and ultimately what should be the target of egalitarian concern cannot be simplistically captured by rights, basic goods, happiness, etc., but must cover the full spectrum of human capabilities. My approach incorporates this insight by following the capabilities approach in saying that what is valuable beyond rational agents, with their equal status as ends, includes all valuable states of being and doing and the capacity to achieve them. And moreover, that respecting the moral equality of persons necessarily involves paying attention to their actual capabilities and achievements in terms of these rational interests. This is part of the reason for the central significance of capabilities in the Discourse-Capabilities Approach. This seems stuck. Oh, here we go. Despite these advantages, I argue that the only way to make the capabilities approach part of an adequate account is to embed it within some other normative theory that could specify a criterion for determining what counts as good as opposed to poor functioning. Nussbaum's neo-Aristotelian version of sense capabilities approach attempts just this. As a criterion for determining which capabilities are valuable, she proposes a principle stating that valuable capabilities are ones that allow us to live a fully human life, understood as a life organized by reason. So what has value, according to Nussbaum, are capabilities that contribute to a rationally ordered human life. What I propose is something akin to these strategies, only I hope leading to a more adequate outcome. Ultimately, I want to claim that the locus of value includes both rational agency and the full spectrum of capabilities that we find to be part of a flourishing human life in the course of a free and open debate embodying a communicative form of reason. I will explain how I hope to arrive at this, beginning with an elaboration of my answer to the question Sen himself left unanswered. That is this: which beings and doings are the ones of value? I'm behind. Okay. How do we know which beings and doings are the ones of value? On one level, I am in accord with Nussbaum and the Aristotelian tradition, which claims that there are certain features of special importance without which a life could not be recognized as fully human, on the basis of which universally valuable human functionings can be defined as the beings and doings which contribute to a rich and fully human life. Notwithstanding well-founded objections to the straight Aristotelian idea that reason affords direct and final insight into a timeless human essence that specifies our place in the world, I cannot foresee the possibility of a moral theory operating with a completely hollow conception of human nature. Instead, I see my approach as a version of humanism. In short, then, I want to answer the question which capabilities are valuable by saying valuable capabilities are the ones that are best for us, the ones we have reason to value, given the kinds of beings we are. But this requires us to ask, third question, what sort of beings are we? All humans can be contrasted in the first place with pure transcendent ethics based on submitting to a transcendent authority or standard. For humanists, humanity becomes the author of its own norms. Instead of norms aimed at denying or repressing oneself in obedience to any external power, ethics focuses precisely on the realization of human potentials. The danger, once value comes to revolve around humanity as opposed to the reverse, is that norms seem to become relative to the arbitrary whims of individual preference. The possibility of a non-subjective normative account of the human being would mitigate this result. Just because value derives from human beings does not mean that anything goes, that there cannot be objective value judgments about what is good or bad for human beings, provided we know something about the nature of human beings. And knowing about human beings need not involve appeal to metaphysics. This brand of humanism can be distinguished from foundationalist forms of essentialism in that it does not start out with a full and adequate picture of human nature. Rather, a satisfactory definition of its subject matter is its aim, not its premise. So instead of answering the question of our nature with a full description that can serve as an epistemic foundation of moral rationalism, I advocate something of a perspectival shift towards the method for answering this question. Nussbaum is allied with the humanist tradition insofar as she constructed a model of human nature based on inferences from observable data and shows that the overarching question of human nature is broken down into a series of more specific questions tied to observable grounding experiences. The specific question we need to ask are anchored to biologically and anthropologically deep-seated facts of our existence. For instance, the fact that we get hot or that we get too hot and too cold, that we love and conflict, laugh and play, eat and breathe, live and die. Questions about what it is to function well and to have the facility to function well must take the form of reflection on how we are able to function with respect to the various spheres in which we necessarily operate as human beings. So instead of just asking, how does a human being function well as such, it becomes salient to ask, how does a human being function well with respect to the fact that he or she is mortal, with respect to the fact that he or she is a sexual being, and so on. This is an advantage. However, there remains a need for some explanation of the method for answering the question, what is virtuous behavior with respect to the various spheres of human functioning? And since no adequate essentialist conception of human nature has emerged to offer a stable foundation for determining exactly what proper human functioning is in every sphere of life, we are led back to ask, here's question 4, how do we figure out who we are and ought to be? And what capabilities are most valuable and worthy of pursuit for beings such as us? There is likely to remain significant disagreement about what good human functioning consists in. Despite this fact, We are fortunately rational beings capable of discursively trying to figure out who we are. We are capable of providing reasons and using language and argument to convince and understand one another. Hence, normative theory, rather than being imposed by an authority, can be conceived as the outcome of a discursive process of refining and revolutionizing our self-understanding and our norms. It is possible then to deal with the fact that there's difference of opinion about our nature, not by stuffing it out, but by recognizing that such difference is unavoidable and yet continuing a dialogue. That we possess such discursive rationality is knowable, I suggest, through a version of Habermasian reconstructive science, which attempts to reconstruct or make explicit deep universal aspects of human nature that lie beneath and make possible our normal daily interactions in social life. I stress that this is a form of reconstructive science that is neither foundationalism nor essentialism. Its insight into human nature do not claim immunity from debate and criticism. Reconstructive science is thoroughly fallibilist, understanding our competencies as subject to change and development, not a form of transcendent argument designed to establish necessary ahistorical conditions. In short, then, my proposed answer is that we work out what we ought to be and what is best for us in a perpetual rational process of communicative discourse, which requires no foundation deeper than the pragmatic presuppositions of communication. Reflections which deserve to be called rational must be conducted according to various rules and principles, which are themselves underwritten by deep-seated features of our nature as social language-using and communicatively acting beings. I claim these features include: 1, principles of reason, which encompass logical and semantic rules; 2, a freedom condition of some kind, which expresses the internal connection between freedom and reason by asserting that for any assent to be considered rational, it must be given freely; and 3, an equality condition, which asserts that all free rational actors involved in the reflective procedures participate on an equal level, requiring reciprocal responsibilities and entitlements of various kinds, the concrete details of which may need to be worked out, negotiated, and renegotiated in the course of debate. It is not possible, without performative contradiction, to engage in rational discussion or coordinate activity on the basis of mutual understanding without accepting these thin universal conditions, at least in principle. The moral norms that govern our collective existence are rationally binding and legitimate only to the extent that they can be seen as the direct outcome of free and fair reflective procedures. At the same time, as indicated by the thick arrows in this figure summarizing my approach, reflective procedures can reflexively make the form and content of the procedure themselves the subject of rational reflection. However, at the deepest level, it does seem impossible to conceive participation in communicative reason without accepting the validity of, in addition to principles of reasoning, the existence of certain objective grounding conditions, as well as the freedom and equality condition that must govern any reflective procedure that deserves the title rational. The principles of reasoning and the freedom condition have been successfully incorporated in different ways into many approaches, but the equality condition has proven both necessary and difficult to explain. Employing a broadly Habermasian-inspired form of justification, I advocate for its inclusion based on its status as a pragmatic presupposition. How much time do I have? Okay. In essence, what I propose doing is embedding the capabilities perspective within a version of communicative ethics, Nussbaum embedded Sen within a neo-Aristotelian account of the person, and with the elaboration of the grounding experiences, introduced a non-subjective element to frame and concretize the questions addressed in moral discourse. I take on board the insights of both Sen and Nussbaum by embedding this approach within an account that is capable of explaining how we can non-subjectively address questions about capabilities and the use of communicative reason, which at the same time succeeds in introducing fundamental moral equality via what I have called the equality condition. Given the significant room for reasonable disagreement on fundamental moral questions that are the subject of reflective procedures, it is necessary to ask a final question of particular relevance to the possibility of a progressive social and political theory. Is it realistic to hope that, guided by community of reason, we could actually arrive at a consensus regarding the nature of the good life that could actually form the basis for a stable and peaceful form of collective life under which free and equal individuals can flourish? I take Rawls, who has grappled so deeply with the specific problems posed by the fact of pluralism, to be the first source of inspiration here. In short, I want to be able to answer the question the same way Rawls would, by saying no, but fortunately this isn't necessary. In other words, the moral basis for a stable and peaceful form of collective life under which free and equal individuals can flourish does not require that we agree on a more or less thorough account of the nature of the good life, only that we share a conception of justice that requires us to constrain our private conceptions when reasoning in the public sphere on matters of collective concern. Rawls wants to constrain absolutely each citizen's rational reflections on the good life, together with their instrumentally rational pursuit of those goals, by the reasonable injunction that they respect what they owe each other, free, rational citizens as moral equals. The discourse capabilities model proposed here introduces the same constraint, only here the reasonable constraints are decidedly not taken from any culturally shared conception, but introduced as the freedom and equality conditions that are basic and universal presuppositions of rational interaction with a status not entirely dissimilar to other principles of reason, such as the law of non-contradiction. I'm going to skip ahead to my summary. So I set out on a Rawlsian tack by trying to explain how a rationalist moral political framework can allow for political stability in spite of the fact of pluralism. In summary, my proposed solution is a version of the capabilities approach, which turns to a version of discourse ethics to provide a procedural account of how we flesh out our understanding of human nature and determine which capabilities are valuable. On this account, a central focus of justice becomes the establishment of the conditions necessary in order for there to exist a space wherein the force of the better argument trumps actual material force, and a mechanism by which the rational outcomes of this space determine the material implementation of public affecting decisions, which is to say, a real democracy. And that's all I wrote.
Okay.
I know you have lots of good questions.
Which part of the project do you think still needs the most development?
Oh gosh, there's a lot of aspects that could still be developed. So I'm not really sure I have a good answer for you on that one. this was a bit of a tough one because it's a very large scheme, and it has background in lots of different areas, and I was trying to give an overview that could be somewhat accessible, but because it assumes a background in so many different areas, it was a little bit of a challenging topic, challenging thing to try and do today. So I feel like that's something that, although that's what I've been working on lately. So I definitely feel like I still need to work on ways of making some articulations of the overall framework more accessible. So that's definitely one area that needs work, I think.
So as you were talking about these ideas, I found my mind drifting towards the status of AI, because when you started describing earlier theories, you talked about the universality of moral acceptance of anything that's capable of reason, which arguably AI meets that criteria. On the other hand, you then transitioned into humanism and grounding morality in this idea of a grounding experience, which humans certainly share much of, and which we share nothing in common with an AI.
Mm-hmm.
I'm kind of curious what your framework would say about moral applications of AI and the possibility of AI as being moral or immoral entities, or is that not even a question that this addresses?
Yeah, there's lots of interesting moral questions about AI. I teach a class in AI ethics right now, so these are issues I'm always grappling with as well. But in terms of like the application of this theory to AI, I guess it would depend on those arguments you were talking about whether AI is rational or not. I don't think I would go along with arguments that think AI is rational, even though like you can perform like just logical operations and so on, right? But that really doesn't have much in common with the kind of rationality I'm talking about in my theory, or from the theories that I'm really drawing on. So like just being able to follow like a set of logical rules, yes, that's part of like rules and principles of logic, but then reason in the human sense is means, like we talked about, like so in Rawls, for example, he has the idea of the rational being the capacity to come up with a conception of what the good life would be for you, right? So I don't think any AI is able to form a conception of what its good life would look like and then find ways to pursue that. Maybe we could debate about that, but that would certainly be one part of it. And then in the version of rationality that I move towards, that follows Habermas, goes beyond that and makes rationality dialogical. So it's related to like a form of life that takes place between individuals who are able to communicate their interaction on the basis and their individual personal ideas of what the good life is, and they're able to coordinate their activity dialogically through a communicative discourse. These all seem like very human things to me.
Other questions?
Thank you. Dr. Daniel Paul Costi, Department of Political Science here at Eastern Oregon University. Thank you for your presentation.
You're welcome.
How do you think this framework would function in periods of extreme polarization? That's my question.
I can't imagine what kind of situation you have in mind here. Is there something particular, like maybe you could flesh out the question a little bit more? Like, do you feel like situations of polarization pose a particular problem for this kind of framework? I'm not quite sure, but I think we often have situations of polarization. I think that this type of theory is the best way of addressing situations like that, because there's no better way to deal with those kind of situations than to work towards a shared understanding through reason. So like in Habermas, who's a great inspiration for this view, he understands like social life to be like coordinated on the basis of a shared understanding of the world, which just kind of functions as these kind of like invisible tracks in the background, which is like, even in a very polarized society, like when you go through your day-to-day life, like 99 point something % of every way you interact with people is based on the shared understanding of the world. Like you say things, people respond, and they accept all the validity claims based by the things that you say. So usually our action is coordinated smoothly just because we say things. People accept what we say, as there's always 3 validity claims raised in everything we say, like a claim to truth, truthfulness, and rightness. And if one of those things get challenged, like sometimes we'll be going through our life and we'll say something and it seems like a person's not being truthful, or they've said something that's not true, or they've said something that violates a norm of some kind, like it's not right in some way. That's when we enter what Habermas calls discourse. So discourse isn't like normal communicative interaction for Habermas. It's a special term that describes a discourse about discourse. So it's a discourse about language. So normally language is how just about all human interaction is coordinated on that basis. But when we say something and a validity claim is challenged, then we step outside of normal language, and then we have to have a discussion about the discussion, right? So even just like a simple claim, right? If I say like, pass me the salt, it's a simple one, but I'm making all those validity claims. So I'm assuming that you can pass me the salt, like I don't have you tied down to your chair, or maybe you're like don't have arms or something, and that there actually is salt on the table. So there's facts that are being assumed there, right? It's also assumed that I'm being truthful, right? So if I say, pass me the salt, you turn, I grab a slice of pizza off your plate. I wasn't really trying to get the salt from you, which it seemed like. I was just trying to distract you so I could steal your pizza, right? So that would be like if I wasn't being truthful, right? Also, maybe it's inappropriate in the society I live to ask one of my superiors or something to pass the salt. So maybe I would have to ask indirectly. So maybe I violated some norm in asking for the salt, right? So maybe it wasn't right in some way. So you could challenge any of those things. And if you do that, then we exit regular discourse. So if I say, pass me the salt, you say, hey, well, what are you talking about? There is no salt on the table. I say, oh, I'm sorry, my bad. There's usually salt here. I forgot to put the salt out. Oh, okay. And then we go back into normal life, right? That resolved it very quickly, right? But when we don't agree on a norm, then we step out of our regular situation. And then, but the thing is, in Habermas, even when we step out of discourse, when we step out of normal language and into discourse, we're still doing communicative interaction, right? So that we can still solve our problems through communication. Like it doesn't have to come to blows. There's still a mechanism to repair, come back to a shared understanding, and then we can enter normal interaction again. That was maybe a long-winded answer to your question, but yeah.
Other questions? One more from Daniel Paul Costi.
Curious why you chose Habermas, then Rawls, and then forgive me, what was the third one?
Nussbaum.
Yeah. These seem to be contemporary philosophers, yeah? Right. And so I'm thinking, bringing up like the notion of the good life, and I think like Epicurus, is that his name? Epicurus is all about pleasure and stuff. So I'm wondering, were they not as interested in reason and rationality, or I guess why did you choose those three to kind of set your foundation?
So what you're saying is my talk was not long enough or dense enough, is what I'm hearing. So instead of coming to this talk next time, you got to read the whole book. But yes, there's a lot of other background. It's a long tradition of moral rationalism. I tried to boil it down to my main contemporary influences for the talk today, but those contemporaries are already incorporating tons of stuff. I talked a little bit about Kant here, so there are many other influences, but Kant is an influence in important ways for both Habermas and Rawls. So I tried to tease out a little bit of that Kantian background, which I think was definitely at play here. That idea of grounding experiences is very much tied to Aristotle. So Aristotle doesn't use that word, grounding experiences, but he has this idea of the virtues. So a good life is about eudaimonia, which is two things. There's primary eudaimonia, which is just like pure contemplation. Ultimately, that's the goal of the good life. So it's kind of very specific, but also it's a holistic view. So it's reason in that sense, but also like a whole rationally ordered life. So you have to function virtuously with respect to all these different spheres of life that Aristotle talked about. How do you determine or find out what that virtue is an interesting question. But at least Aristotle started with those grounding experiences of like, well, how do we face danger? Like, are we going to be like, what is too brash? What's going to be bravery, right? And what's going to be cowardice, right? There's going to be extremes in two directions, and the virtuous behavior is always going to be that golden mean in between, right? But there were all these different spheres of life he identified where we can behave virtuously. So a good human being is a virtuous person who has all the virtues, right? And that's a big inspiration for the capabilities approach in Nussbaum. So there's a lot of that Aristotle really in the background of her approach, which I think she does a good job of picking up on a lot of the good things in Aristotle. So a lot of good things about Kant and Aristotle and many others that feed through these contemporary approaches.
5 o'clock, so I think we better wrap it up there. Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.